You know, I was thinking about this early on, and the business of commemoration. I'll talk about commemoration a little bit at the end. And I was thinking that in the lifetime I spent at the Staffordshire Regiment, the summer regimental day was that was celebrated by the North Staffords, and it seems even more strange now, after we look at what happened on the 29th September 1918. The North Staffords, instead of celebrating or commemorating that day, decided to commemorate the 31st of July and the opening of the Third Battle of Ypres. You do wonder why. I suspect it was a bit of snobbery between regulars, because it was the first North Staffords, and territorials. And I'm going to be talking about territorials largely today, or those who originated as territorials. Well, one of the most iconic photographs of the Great War is that of the territorials of 137 Staffordshire Brigade, lining the eastern bank of the St. Quentin Canal, whilst being addressed by their brigade commander from the rampart of the Rickvale Bridge. It appears on the copy of my copy of on the cover of my copy of John Terrain's To Win a War, rather appropriately. And while tempted to lead with maybe a flippant remark, how Staffordshire won the Great War, a remark I lay at John Bourne's feet, or the Stoke Sentinel, which would say how North Staffordshire won the Great War, the events of which I speak, I think, are undoubtedly impressive. And I don't need to tell you that, of course, that popular image of the Great War on the Western Front can still be that of mud and slaughter from beginning to end. But this photograph, taken late in the day on the 30th September 1918, the day after these men had stormed and broken the German defences on the Hindenburg Line, and more so the story behind it, demonstrates something very different. I think it smells of success and victory. The British Empire Army was certainly at the top of its game, and the battle here, one of the finest ever examples of fighting power applied intelligently. David Lloyd George, not known for heaping praise on his army, called the battle here the greatest chapter in our military history, and that it was achieved by a brigade of the 46th North Midland Division was something of a cherry on that cake. I'm going to focus mainly on 137 Brigade's exploits that day, but I'll of course put the whole thing in context, and I'll begin by explaining what brought the British Army to this point on the map. And speaking of maps, this one should orientate you to the area of this particular action shown in the box, just north of St. Quentin. Well, the 100 days were taking the course. I'm going to show quite a lot of photographs and maps. Most of the photographs are fairly generic for obvious reasons. But this one here, a good picture of the 100 days within that overall strategic concept of attacking the Germans everywhere, all of the time, and with no let-up. And by mid-September, the British had regained all of the ground lost in the German spring offensive and stood poised in front of the Siegfriedstellung, the extensive defense zone that the British called the Hindenburg Line, and to which, of course, the Germans had withdrawn to in March 1917. This is a situation map from that time for the 1st of April 1917. I know it's probably a little hard to see on small screens, but in the area in which we have a particular interest, General Sir Henry Rawlinson's Fourth Army was now back in what had been the British front line before the German spring offensive, and sitting within about 3,000 yards of the main Hindenburg position and the St. Quentin Canal. The formidable reputation of the German position certainly preceded it. A soldier in the 4th Leicesters had found a note from Fritz in an abandoned position forward of the German outpost line that warned, "When we stop, we shall stop and stop you in a manner you won't appreciate." And General Erich Ludendorff had ordered his armies to show that any further attacks on the Siegfriedstellung will be utterly broken. The line is an impregnable rampart. But the British had a very good idea of the extent and detail of the whole position, from documents captured early on in the Battle of Amiens and from extensive aerial reconnaissance. So while the Germans might have been building and adding to their system for over 2 years, the British had been examining every element of it. The real prize here was for the British artillery. Much of it could now remain concealed and safe until the hour of the attack, firing with confidence on targets fixed on the map and using science to do the rest. Well, some words about the German defenders, on whom there was good intelligence. This was the front of General von Karlowitz's Second Army, whose previous commander, von der Marwitz, had been relieved for his army's failings on the 18th September at the Battle of Epée. 1st Bavarian Corps defended this sector with its 10 divisions, and the 75th Reserve Infantry Division was roughly aligned with 46th North Midland Division's attack. And this 4th Army situation map shows the situation at 6 p.m. on the 28th of September, with the 75th Division denoted as a fresh division that had come into the line on the 20th September. Von Karlowitz had 3 divisions in reserve, but just one of these, the 21st, and you can see it there, was in the Belenglise sector. There was a rough parity in numbers of men, well, never a good ratio for an attacking force, and rough parity in materiel, there being no shortage of German artillery and machine guns. But the Allies enjoyed one advantage, as the official history put it, of high morale and complete confidence. The enemy had lost the initiative and was discouraged. Well, of the concepts that underline the Hindenburg Line system, here there was a major fault. You stand today, many will have done this, a little way to the east of the 4th Australian Division Memorial on Buisson Ridge, a couple of kilometers west of the St. Quentin Canal, and the fault is obvious. The superiority in defense of a reverse slope, the reverse slope position is beyond doubt, but here the canal was too tempting an obstacle not to utilize. Thus, the whole main German line would be exposed to observation and fire should the Allies capture the high ground to the west. But not being stupid, the Germans also built great strength into their forward positions too. I can illustrate it all here. A contemporary map of our area of interest showing the main features of the German defences, all marked in blue at that time. The triangle is where the Aussie Memorial is now located, on Watling Street on the British maps, leading northeast to Rickville Bridge, astride the canal. The underline of the canal there for our interest. The evolution of German defense tactics is apparent, but in the Hindenburg Line, it had even greater depth. In Allied nomenclature, the advanced Hindenburg Line comprised 2 lines forward of the canal: the Bestellung in dead ground, marked today by the Autoroute des Anglais, and 1,000 yards to 1,500 yards behind the Arstellung, which intermingled to north and south with the main Siegfriedstellung of the canal itself. And behind all this, the support line, the Zwischenstellung, and then about another 8,000 yards or so from the canal, an entire secondary reserve line, the Beauvoir-Fonsomme line, then under construction. The Germans held no illusions as to what was coming and placed a massive emphasis on machine guns. But here, there were no built-in anti-tank defences due to the assumed impossibility that tanks could cross the canal, correct assumption. Well, the Allied plan was certainly ambitious. Marshal Foch intended a grand offensive to be initiated in late September, and Haig's army was allocated the heaviest and most critical tasks. And for all of this, he had on the sector running from Armentières in the north to just short of Saint-Quentin in the south, 4 armies in order from the north: the British 5th, 1st, 3rd, and of our interest today, Rawlinson's 4th. This was 12 corps, 52 infantry divisions, including 2 American. Further north, the Belgian group of armies, the Belgian and the British 2nd, would attack at Ypres and in Flanders. And further south, the entire French and bulk of the American armies would also attack. And Foch's overall plan was this. On the 26th September, the Americans and French would attack in the Argonne. On the 27th of September, the British 3rd and 1st armies along the Canal du Nord. On the 28th of September, the group of armies in Flanders. And then on the 29th of September, the British 4th Army and the French 1st Army on their right. And this is what happened. By these means would the German defences be penetrated and split open. Rawlinson had 4 corps in 4th Army, 3rd, 9th and 13th British, and the Australian American Corps. The army's main attack, that is the one to be initiated on the 29th of September, would have the Australian American Corps on the left and 9th British Corps on the right. But before that, a number of preliminary operations were necessary to secure the high ground overlooking the Hindenburg Line, and I'll cover these briefly. Rawlinson committed 3 corps to these tasks, and shown here, 3rd Corps is on the left, the Australians in the centre, 9th Corps on the right. And to orientate you again, here's Riqueval Bridge. The main objective was to capture the Beestellung and the high ground in the area of what had been a British front line in March 1918. And on the morning of the 18th September, 8 divisions attacked against fierce German resistance. Success on both flanks was limited, so unsurprisingly in a way, as neither 3rd Army to the north nor the 1st French Army to the south attacked that day. But in the centre, 1st and 4th Australian divisions, supported by 9 tanks, achieved most of what was needed by 1 o'clock the following morning and were in occupation of most of the German outpost line. And this accounts for the memorial to the 4th Australian Division being on Buisson Ridge today. The next 10 days witnessed all the activity necessary to prepare for the main attack. On the 21st of September, the North Midlanders relieved the Australians in place. The Germans did not remain quiet, but their efforts to retrieve their position largely failed. Nevertheless, Germans remained in large numbers in trenches and behind wire west of the canal and in what they could preserve of their outpost line. Back to this map and the Riqueval Bridge, again for reference. The village of Pontreuil, you can see there ringed, was a major German strongpoint that dominated the southern approach, and importantly, another bridge at Bel-Inglise. The village had to be captured before the main attack. The operation was entrusted mainly to the 1st 5th Leicesters of 138 Brigade, supported by 1st 6th Sherwood Foresters of 139 Brigade, that battalion commanded by Bernard Van, that priest turned soldier who won the VC on the 29th and was killed on the 3rd of October. They had the village after a day and a half of severe fighting, but worryingly were forced to abandon their gains in the early hours of the 26th. And more worryingly, on the far left, the American 27th and 30th divisions were unable to force all of the German outposts west of the canal. Riqueval Bridge shown for reference again. I'll keep doing this, that the Australian Corps Commander, General Sir John Monash, requested a delay in the main operation, which Rawlinson, understandably, refused to grant. The preliminary bombardment was about to begin. Well, on the left of the North Midlanders, in the early evening of the 26th, The 1st 4th Leicesters swept the Germans out of pike copse and peg copse. The Germans again fought back with local counterattacks, but the Leicesters clung on, and when they were relieved in the early hours of the 28th, it was by the 1st 6th North Staffords, and they were wearing life jackets. So some words on the 46th North Midland Division. It was constituted practically the same as it had been when the war began. 137 Staffordshire Brigade, 138 Lincoln and Leicester Brigade, and 139 Sherwood Forester Brigade. That all of the men were still drawn from their respective counties was no longer the case, of course, and conscripts from all over the country now formed substantial parts of each battalion. There was some Scotsmen and some Americans knocking about within the division. Each brigade was now only 3 infantry battalions. The 1st 5th North Staffords, the Potteries Territorials, having been broken up in January 1918, as we know, when all infantry brigades were reduced from 4 to 3 battalions. But I must acknowledge Lewison Wood's extraordinary 2 volumes on this battalion and his not unjustified claim that it lived on in the 1st 6th North, recruited originally from Burton-on-Trent and where many of the men went. The other 2 battalions were from the Black Country, the 1st 5th South Staffords from the Walsall area and the 1st 6th South from Wolverhampton. It was said that they weren't exactly twinned as such, but they did share a suicide pact. The whole division still seemed to maintain its proud North Midlands territorial tradition, and they had an excellent GOC in the 40-year-old Major General Gerald Boyd, DSO, DCM. The latter earned when he was a private soldier in the Devonshire Regiment in the Boer War, and indeed his DSO in the Boer War too. The division was at this time well led and trained, but with something of a checkered history, it might be said. Its selection for and experience for this attack on the Hindenburg line might therefore seem surprising, but it was not intended as Rawlinson's main effort and had been given, in General Boyd's view, a sacrificial stunt to perform. This was said with feeling, and perhaps another sacrificial stunt might be more appropriate. The 46th Division is perhaps best remembered today for its failure at Gomcourt on the 1st of July 1916, but it was perceived to have failed too at the Hohenzollern Redoubt on the 13th of October 1915, the division's worst day of the war in respect of casualties. Following Gomcourt, they were written off by their corps commander as having a lack of offensive spirit, and their GOC, Montague Stuart Wortley, was sacked. Well, the division's part in the coming operation was unenviable to say the least, and General Monash considered it unachievable. The Fourth Army main effort rested with his Australian American Corps, where the 2 American divisions would lead, and they would attack across the line of the St. Quentin Canal, where for the most part it ran underground through the Bellicourt Tunnel, the line of which shown here. This was an impressive piece of Napoleonic era engineering and was known to garrison considerable numbers of German troops. It's worth showing you these contemporary images taken of the southern entrance to the tunnel from the air here, which gives a good impression of the canal cutting after capture, and inside where the Germans had constructed this concrete wall. On the Australian-American right, 9th Corps would provide the supporting effort. The North Midlanders would attack across the open canal, and with the 1st Division on their right and south of Bellinglees, who would make a strong feint to distract the Germans. One of the 46th Division's Royal Engineer officers reckoned that at best we might get a foothold in the further bank of the canal, but at a cost which would leave us no longer a fighting force. And referring to Gomcourt, he considered the division well used to these affairs, having in past years been given attacks to carry out across belts of uncut wire in which it had suffered severely. But he reckoned too that their morale was high. They had had a pleasant and recent view of our adversaries' backs and had felt ourselves definitely their superiors. Well, the division issued its operation order on the 25th of September, the Tuesday, for the attack on the 29th, the Saturday. There's no photograph of General Boyd and his staff, but this one shows Brigadier General John Campbell, VC, DSO, the Tally-Ho VC, and the staff of the Staffordshire Brigade. On the left, Archie White sends the opening paragraph reading this: at an hour and date to be notified later, 46 the on will all be equal to the occasion and win through. I'm stopping a moment because I'm a little concerned I've lost.
Yeah, Jim, there's some extremely bad buffering there. When you had the photograph of the officers, you just totally broke up. Do you want to just rewind to that slide and recommence?
I will do that. Let me get the screen back up again.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about this, folks. Just a bit of local difficulty with the internet, I should imagine.
Okay. Am I on shared screen, David?
Not yet. Not yet.
Let's get you down that.
Yeah. Okay. I've got your
There we go.
Brilliant. Yeah. Do you want to just take it from there? If it buffers again, I'll just let you know. Thank you.
Okay.
Cheers.
Oh, where was I? Right, I'll go back to I'll just go back to the order that was given in the divisional orders. At an hour and date to be notified later, the 46th Division, as part of a major operation, will cross the St. Quentin Canal, capture the Hindenburg Line, and advance to the Green Line. Were it so simple. But General Boyd, while conscious of the immense difficulties men faced, and despite personal misgivings, told them the day before they went in, the division has been given the important and honorable task of forcing the canal, breaking the Hindenburg Line, and leading the 9th Corps through, joining hands with the Americans coming from the north. I am more than confident that you will all be equal to the occasion and win through. Well, this useful map comes from the divisional history. Rickenvale Bridge highlighted again, and you can see the 3 brigades as they stood at 0 hour. In simple terms, the plan was this. On the night of the 27th, 28th September, 137 Brigade, the Staffords, would relieve 138 Brigade, the Lincolns and Leicesters, in the front line. Early morning of the 29th, the Staffordshire Brigade would attack, force a crossing of the canal, break into and through the Hindenburg Line, referred to as the Blue Line, and reorganize on the Brown Line. The final objective were 137 Brigade. On success being achieved, 138 Brigade on the left and 139 Brigade on the right would pass forward and attack through to the Green Line, the division's final objective and the objective stipulated by Fourth Army. The 32nd Division would then pass through the Lot and continue the attack east. On the left, as we've heard, the Australian-American Corps would attack over the Bel-Ingliese Tunnel, led by its 2 American divisions. The 30th American Division was on the right of this attack and separated from the North Midlanders by a 1,000-yard gap. But on crossing the canal, they turned south, closed the gap, and joined hands with the British. And on the right of the division, as we've also heard, the British 1st Division would hold a defensive flank, threatening an attack, and thus fixing the German defenders in place to the south and east of Bel-Ingliese. There's a marked simplicity to the written orders, those for 137 Brigade being just 1 page with a number of accompanying instructions and traces for maps, and critically, very detailed plans for the artillery bombardment. The Germans were very aware that the British would be attacking very soon, and thus, foregoing overall surprise, an extensive preliminary bombardment was executed, involving over 1,000 field guns and just under 600 mediums and heavies. This section of a Fourth Army map shows the gun areas and a table for the 9th Corps artillery alone. The barrage commenced at 22:30 on the 26th and comprised a mixture of high explosive, shrapnel, and mustard gas, the British using this for the first time. Here's the barrage map, and I'm going to come back to this barrage map. Over 2.5 days, 65,000 tons of artillery ammunition was augmented by a machine gun barrage from nearly 200 Vickers guns, deluging the German front line with something like 50,000 rounds every minute. One of the British gunners said that the noise and concussion got so bad that it was difficult to walk. I had to put this photograph in, a rather incongruous photo of the 137 Brigade band in Bel-Ingliese, taken shortly after the battle, but it gives an idea of the devastation. But the whole landscape was a wilderness due to a combination of the German occupation clearing fields of fire and the incessant shelling. But the Germans didn't just hunker down and take it. Their extensive artillery struck back where it could, and unsurprisingly, local counterattacks threatened to disrupt British preparations. At 10 o'clock on the morning of the 28th, German infantry broke into the outpost company of the 1st 5th South Staffords in the centre of the brigade, and after severe fighting, the line gave way, and Germans bombed their way north against D Company of the 6th North. The whole brigade grew short of ammunition, particularly bombs, but much use was made of captured German grenades and rifles, and one stout North Stafford, Private Bertie Mountford from Uttoxeter, won the military medal for using a captured German machine gun very effectively against its former owners. Eventually, the German efforts waned, but the 6th North CO withdrew D Company back to his main line. Worryingly, the Germans could not help but notice that the forward British positions were stacked with scaling ladders, life belts, collapsible boats, and the like, and would have reported back almost immediately that there would be an attempt on forcing the canal, and it would not be long in coming. I think this trench map is distinct enough to develop the unfolding battle. Ricqueval Bridge highlighted, and the Bel-Ingliese Bridge are almost as important, shown here. The brigade plan had all 3 battalions in line. On the left, the 1st 6th North Staffords, in the centre, the 1st 5th South Staffords, and on the right, the 1st 6th South Staffords. There was no brigade reserve as such, but a company from the 2 supporting brigades of the division was allocated to each of the 3 Stafford battalions for mopping up operations and the escort of prisoners. Interestingly, divisional orders also made the overall intent very clear. The forward battalions of the 138th and 139th Infantry Brigades will keep in close liaison with GOC 137th Infantry Brigade and have their headquarters and observers so placed that they can obtain immediate information of the state of affairs east of the canal. Should it appear at any time that the 137th Brigade, having crossed the canal, are being outfought through lack of support, these battalions will, on their own initiative and without waiting for orders, advance across the canal to reinforce. And this is recognizably what would be called mission command in a later generation. Understanding and acting on the higher intent and using initiative. Well, it's not new, and it's not, and it wasn't then. The 6th North and 6th South were allocated additional trench mortars, and one company from the Divisional Machine Gun Battalion would cross the canal in direct support. And 8 Mark V tanks were also allocated to support the division, but they were to cross to the north with the Americans and would not be available to support 137 Brigade. 0 hour was fixed for 0550 on the morning of the 29th. In the darkness, battalion officers moved out into no man's land, out onto the tape line on which the lead companies would form up 200 yards behind the barrage that would accompany the assault. At 0520, with 30 minutes to go, the men of the lead companies clambered out of their trenches and as silently as possible and as unencumbered as possible, as ordered, walked forward and settled themselves down on the tape line. The preliminary bombardment had continued unabated, which afforded some cover, and as 0 hour approached, a thick fog began to descend across the entire front, which was to prove a godsend to the attacking infantry. Well, at precisely 0550, the lightning bombardment presaging the attack opened up. And if not the heaviest level of artillery support of any British division in the war, it certainly was a lot. Excuse me. On the start line, whistles blew, and the men stood up across the brigade front and walked towards the Hindenburg line. And this might seem surprising, but the initial assault was done at a steady walk to get the battalions through the remaining German outposts in some sort of order and across the canal. And the accounts in all the diaries are a little ambiguous, but we don't have long unbroken lines from a couple of years before, and possibly they were walking, it seems likely they were walking in platoon blobs by company. Whatever it was, the technique required great steadiness and discipline. The protecting barrage advanced at the pace of 100 yards every 2 minutes to the blue line. The infantry would lean into its own barrage, maintaining a distance of about 200 yards behind its advance. The barrage would pause on this line until 0 + 1 hour 40 minutes, and then shift to a safety distance of 300 yards for 30 minutes to allow for the capture and consolidation of the German positions. At 0 + 2 hours 10 minutes, the Staffords would then go forward again behind their barrage, but this time at the slower pace of 100 yards every 4 minutes, to the brown line. From this line, the barrage would lift to a safety distance again and would be maintained there for 3 hours until 0 + 5 hours and 30 minutes, when it was trusted 138 and 139 brigades would pass through the Staffords and continue the attack to the east. And that, extraordinary as it might seem, is what happened. Let me just come back to some additional detail on the German position in front of 137 Brigade. Remember that the Germans had first started to prepare the Hindenburg Line in 1916, and 2 years on, it was an extensive structure. This is part of the main line in front of Cambrai, I believe. The whole Stellung was a formidable series of defences built to a depth of about 10,000 yards, some 5.5 miles. The advanced line had largely been captured already, as we've heard, and the reserve line was not fully dug, although its wire, seen here, was well developed. But that left the main Hindenburg line and the support line, and through its breadth and depth, the whole system was protected by vast swathes of barbed wire, often in belts hundreds of feet deep, and countless machine guns in concrete emplacements. This one near Bellinglees after its capture. And then there was the canal itself. In front of the Staffords, the northern half of the canal ran through a very deep cutting, some 50 feet deep, with steep banks at 50-degree angles. The canal bed itself is 35 yards wide, and in the north, the water was up to 10 feet deep, lying at the bottom of 10 feet high brick walls. In the southern part, approaching Bellinglees, there was little water, but the problem there was mud. It was everywhere protected by wire and machine guns. But it's of importance to note that the bridges at Ricqueval here and at Bellinglees here, and you can see the lack of water in the south, they remained intact, the Ricqueval bridge having a light railway running over it. There were a number of narrow footbridges spanning the canal too. The Germans had to maintain their positions west of the canal, of course, but it was safe to assume that all crossings were prepared for demolition. Well, this might well prove to be Ludendorff's impregnable rampart. So as not to reinforce failure, 137 Brigade was to signal success only when the canal had been crossed and both the blue line and the brown line had been captured. Well, the infantry wouldn't be on their own, of course. The artillery's 106 fuse long proved extremely good at shattering barbed wire and thus clearing paths, and without tanks, this would be critical. And the Royal Engineers had come up with some traditional and some ingenious methods to get the assaulting infantry across the canal. Collapsible boats and light rafts, mats to deal with deep mud, heaving lines and blocks, and scaling ladders. And every man was to be issued with a life jacket, 3,000 of these having been collected from the Channel ferries. Nevertheless, if the bridges, and especially the Ricqueval Bridge, could not be captured intact, reinforcement of initial success and all follow-on operations would be severely jeopardized. And while a section of Royal Engineers was allocated to each battalion, it was the infantry that had to carry all this kit in addition to their own considerable load. Still, it was rather amusing to see that they had their priorities right, for the assault battalions were also ordered to carry their rum ration. Well, the battle was supported by 9 Brigade Royal Air Force. Doesn't sound much until one considers that the brigade contained 20 squadrons of light bombers and fighters. The night preceding the attack, night bombers targeted fortified villages and railheads using aircraft like this FE-2B. The weather during the morning of the attack precluded use of air support. But later in the day, the RAF's fighters tore into the German balloon line, and on the following day, with improved weather, ground strafing recommenced. This wasn't close air support as we know it today, but it had an impact nonetheless. Well, I'm now going to address the attack in detail by battalion in the order left, centre, right. 1st 6th North Staffords on the left. They were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Evans, a Royal Welsh Fusilier, and he'd be killed on the 3rd of October. The battalion frontage was about 800 yards, with its left boundary on Peg Copse and a line running from there due east through Ricqueval Bridge to Billiard Copse. They had that gap on their left of about 1,000 yards where the 30th American Division was attacking, but some protection would be provided by a smoke barrage. The battalion attacked 2 companies up, B on the left under Captain Humphrey Charlton, who'd been commissioned from the Veterinary Corps, and A on the right under 2nd Lieutenant Harold Thompson, who'd been a corporal in the 16th West Yorkshires. In immediate support, C Company under Second Lieutenant May on the left, and D Company under Captain Frederick Newton, MC, on the right. And he'd been a sergeant in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Well, at 0 hour, the battalion advanced and was soon into the German defences. Due to the very thick fog, the officers out in front used their compasses to excellent effect to maintain direction. German machine gun fire was their chief trouble at the beginning, but they were firing blindly, and the North Staffers were very quickly amongst them with a bayonet. There was then no further serious opposition until the canal itself, and here German machine guns firing on fixed lines swept the length of both sides. It had taken just 30 minutes to reach the canal, and there was no hesitation as the North Staffords flung themselves into the deep water. In places, they were surprised to find that the footbridges erected by the Germans were mainly intact, and these were very quickly utilised. Rather more surprisingly, the Rickville Bridge was still standing. Charlton, with about 9 men, reached the bridge at the same time his company reached the canal side, 0620. As they went for it, 2 German soldiers coming from the east side, in an apparent attempt to blow the charges under the bridge, were bayoneted, and Lance Corporal John Smith, with his Lewis gun, sprayed bullets at the far side where Germans were dug in alongside a concrete pillbox, which is still there. With Lance Corporal Openshaw of the Royal Engineers, Charlton cut the wires for the charges and rendered the bridge safe. More men joined his party in leaving 3 of them on the bridge. One of them is Batman, I'll mention later, to act as guides. B Company carried on. The Germans were greatly surprised by the sudden arrival of British soldiers, and within 20 minutes, just 20 minutes, the bulk of the 6th North were over the canal and up the far bank. They already had in the bag the CO of a German battalion and about 130 prisoners. Where German machine gun nests and field guns held out, they invariably fell victim to North Stafford bayonets. Well, this was an extraordinary achievement already. The barrage timings put British shells on the immediate far bank at 0 plus 24 minutes, and A and B companies were on the near bank and ready to cross within a couple of minutes of this. And they simply carried on through the Hindenburg main line, shooting, bayoneting, and bombing as they went. There was some time for reorganization before reaching the blue line itself, the barrage pausing here from 0 plus 28 until 0 plus 100. Under this protection, there was time for proper mopping up, evacuation of casualties, and resupply of ammunition. Then at 0 plus 130, so at 0800, with C and D companies having leapfrogged, the North Staffords went forward again. The barrage moved again to protect them, and around 0830, they were on the brown line, the brigade objective. Critically, on their right, the 5th South had had similar success, and on their right, the 6th South had had the same, and they were all in line together. Of the Americans on their left, there was yet no sign for now, but fortunately, this did not prove to be the disaster it could have been. Importantly, both 138 Brigade and 139 Brigade were already crossing the canal and would be ready to pass through the Staffords after further consolidation at 11:20. The battalion had had 15 men killed and 70 wounded, and just 3 men were missing. Amongst the awards for this action, Colonel Evans and Captain Charlton received the DSO. Corporal Smith received a bar to his DCM, and that sapper, Corporal Openshaw, was recommended for the VC, but he also received a DCM. Well, next on the right, in the centre of the brigade, was the Walsall Battalion, the 1st 5th South Staffords, commanded by Captain Acting Lieutenant Colonel Arthur White, who'd come from the 4th East Surreys. They covered a frontage of about 500 yards. Because of the casualties sustained earlier during the attack on the German outpost line, C and D companies had been combined under Captain Edward Mennell. They would attack on the left, with B Company under Lieutenant Robert Gillinder on the right. And A Company, commanded by Captain Tyler, was in support. Between A and the forward companies, A Company of 8th Sherwood Foresters, designated for mopping up, was meant to be placed, but by 0 hour had not turned up. As with the 6th North, the 5th South got forward to the canal quickly, the German line posing no trouble, according to the CO's report. German artillery seemed quick to respond to the attack, but it was firing blind, and the main enemy barrage came down behind the British front line. This was usual and could put paid to reinforcements having any chance of getting forward, but the supporting brigades had most of their men in and forward of the British front line already, and casualties were few. The 5th South, while suffering rather more from German machine gun fire and problems in maintaining direction, was on the canal within 50 minutes, by which time they already had 160 prisoners. B Company on the right veered off towards Bellingleys village, leaving a gap between the lead companies. Actually, when you look at the map, they were a bit lost. But this gap was filled by a section from the Brigade Trench Mortar Battery, and fortuitously, the Sherwood Forester Company had now found its way forward. Across this battalion's front, there were no bridges, and the men had no option but to go into the water. Captain Raymond Priestley, who wrote the divisional history of this battle, noted that the far bank was very strongly defended, but the fog afforded such excellent cover that enemy fire was inaccurate and there were few casualties. There was some pretty excellent leadership by officers and NCOs who ensured that the pace of the attack was kept up, and the Germans were again very surprised by the speed of everything. And so this is one of 2 large wall paintings in Walsall Town Hall, and it gives a good idea of the conditions. Just as the lead companies got to the near bank of the canal, the Sherwood Forester Company reached them, and they all went at it together. Corporal Parker, one of the Foresters' Lewis gunners, provided one of the few first-hand accounts of what happened, and he wrote this. The idea was to part swim, part wade across, rifles held above heads, machine guns ditto. When one realizes how much the gun weighs and Jerry is firing at you, one can see what a picnic it would be. The other members of your team are loaded up with ammunition and a canvas bucket of Mills grenades, so all set for a good time. Over we went, slipping and sliding down the canal bank to the cold water below. How any of us reached the water beats me, but a surprising number did. The water was up to our armpits, and holding the gun above my head was difficult enough without being machine gunned as well. Clawing our way onto the bank, we were underneath some of the machine guns, making it more difficult to hit us, so my team and many others threw Mills grenades into the various tunnels nearest us, while clinging for dear life to any projections on the bank. Well, on the right, Lieutenant Gillinder had been wounded, and Second Lieutenant Clifford Jones took command of B Company 5th South. Although too far to their right, they'd made such good progress that half the men got onto the bridge, thankfully intact, and got into the northern part of Bellingleys village, while the other half of the company crossed the water, moving up towards La Barraque. There's a small Wargraves Commission cemetery there today. They captured more German machine guns and 4 field guns, thus easing the way for the remainder of the battalion, and young Jones won an MC. Well, along the front, as the Staffords had been clearing through to the blue line and thus through the main defence line, the fog had started to clear and they found themselves amongst bewildered groups of Germans. One officer with just his Batman took prisoner a group of 75, and Corporal Ferguson, who with his section had rounded up individuals who had lost their way, cleared out German dugouts and bagged 10 machine guns and nearly 100 prisoners. Priestley made a point of mentioning that German artillerymen in particular stuck to their guns, And with many German machine gunners doing the same, the going for the Staffords was not a piece of cake. But nevertheless, progress was astonishing. Getting news of this progress back to headquarters remained a great challenge. CO 5th South Staffords reported difficulties of communication were great. Shell fire broke wires, wire was scarce, Lucas lamps were useless, but information came back by wounded, who seemed to make it a point of honor to keep battalion headquarters informed of what was happening. 21 men had been killed, and there were 107 wounded and 59 missing at the end of the day. Many of the latter turned up later, having got mixed up with the flanking battalions. Awards were again generous, Colonel White receiving a well-deserved DSO. The first 6th South Staffords on the far right was commanded by another acting Lieutenant Colonel, Captain Cecil Lister, MC, previously of the Northumberland Fusiliers. This battalion had the narrowest frontage of the three, of just 400 yards, but it had two specific objectives: the Bellinglees Bridge and the Bellinglees Tunnel. This tunnel, shown in yellow here, just short of 1,500 yards long, ran from the village towards Manny-la-Fosse and was not part of the canal, but had been built by the Germans as a shelter for around 3,000 men, held in reserve, and a field hospital. This air photo was taken in May 1917, and you can see the original Bellinglees Bridge clearly, and the tunnel is identified as under construction. This later air photo looks like it was taken after the bridge had been knocked out and before the Germans built a wooden structure, which was the one that was captured. The tunnel had something like 19 entrances, and I've picked out some that were identified on the air photograph, and you can see the German trenches running through the devastated village. Colonel Lister organized his attack on a single company frontage, with all four companies attacking in order A, B, C, D, with about 100 yards between each. The idea was for supporting companies to be held back, being called forward in turn when the leading company required their support. But the fog rapidly screwed this up, and by the time A company was on the near bank, there were already men from the other companies up with them. The 6th South benefited especially from the British machine gun barrage and had little difficulty in reaching the canal. Excuse me. Their approach took them through some dead ground in Chopper Ravine, the use of which probably accounted for the single company frontage. And the ground then, when you walk this, the ground then slopes up gently towards the canal, but the Germans had largely abandoned their forward line of trenches, sparsely held and easily overcome, as the battalion history recorded, although machine guns on the far side continued to sweep the area. In this part, the challenge was different to that further north. Now, the canal here did not run through that steep cutting, and in places the water had given way to deep mud. Battalion orders told that each man should enter the canal as he came to it, and everywhere men jumped down into whatever surface awaited them and swam or waded across. Percy Teton, commanding C Company, he was to die of wounds on the 17th of October, was much disgusted to discover that, having waded through the cold and fetid water, one of the German footbridges was just a few yards away from him, which he'd not seen due to the fog. Well, the battalion was muddled up. With not much organisation remaining, the 6th South started to move across the far side and invest the village. And as we've heard, B Company from the 5th South was there in the mix too. But they all knew to a man what they had to do. Bellinglees had taken a massive pummeling from the British artillery, and while there were some pockets of resistance, the stunned German defenders could do little to stop the attack. The first line of trenches in the main German line were also unoccupied, and fortunately the fog persisted long enough for the Staffords to get into the most heavily fortified part. Here in the murk, men shouted, "Are you Staffords?" before they dealt with their victims. Well, this is what their war history says. I find it hard to believe. I'm pretty sure that these Black Country boys would have called out, "Is that Yao Mara?" Well, the battalion history noted that parties of NCOs and men overran the enemy trenches like locusts after the now familiar manner of attack. German prisoners were captured in shoals, heavily protected dugouts, disgorging numbers of terror-stricken men. One Lewis gunner is reported to have said to an emerging German, "You're a dead 'un unless you've got some fags." On the north side of the village, the entrances to the tunnel began to be encountered. Where exits were found, they were stopped by teams of bombers and Lewis gunners, and Percy Teton had his men drag a captured German howitzer into one of the entrances and fire it down the passage. Around 2,000 nerve-shattered Germans emerged. Amongst the prisoners taken were electrical staff who were returned to the tunnel to restart the generator and volunteered the information that it was booby-trapped for demolition. So here too, on the right of the brigade attack, success was absolute. Casualties for the 6th South were also remarkably light, and they had the bridge. While the Sherwood Foresters of 139 Brigade were already starting to cross to the east side, German prisoners in their hundreds waited patiently to head west and escape the battlefield once and for all. By around 0830, a little over 2.5 hours after 0 hour, the Staffordshire Brigade was firm on the Brown Line, exactly where they should have been. And by then, the scene on the Riqueval Bridge would have been something like this. The fog had begun to clear as the 3 battalions had begun their attack from the Blue Line at 0800. But they were now 30 minutes later on their final objective and sorting out their defence, posting Lewis guns and Stokes mortars. German resistance had been practically non-existent. Their heavy artillery remained active, where it had not been crushed by British counter-battery fire, but it was unaware of its target, except to fire speculatively on the line of the canal. And now the success signal, white over white over white, could now be fired, and the British artillery put down the protective barrage across the entire frontage of the brigade. At 200 yards distance, this obliterated anything to the front of the Staffords for another 2.5 hours or so, while the Lincolns and Leicesters on the left crossed by the Riqueval Bridge, and the Sherwood Foresters on the right crossed by the Bellenglise Bridge. The Divisional Machine Gun Battalion and Mortar Company were also on the move, as was the field artillery, and all of the logistic necessities to ensure success was maintained. At precisely 11:20, 5.5 hours after 0, 138 and 139 brigades on time pressed forward. On the left, 4th Leicesters led, followed by the 5th Lincolns and the 5th Leicesters. The main objective was the village of Manny-la-Fosse. But the main concern was the open flank and the whereabouts of the 30th American Division. Their attack across the top of the Bellicourt Tunnel had not gone well, although not for want of bravery, and there was more success on the right. Eventually, the 5th Australian Division was passed through and made contact with the Lincolns. On the division's right, 8th Sherwood Foresters led, followed by the 6th and then 5th. Their main objective was Layout Court, and the 6th Battalion was passed through the 8th to take the village on. It was for the action at Layout Court that Bernard Vann was awarded the VC. Both brigades were eventually supported by some tanks, which had come down from the north through the Australians and Americans as planned. But their intervention proved indecisive, as they largely became prey to German field guns. By mid-afternoon, the 46th North Midland Division had achieved all of its objectives. The Hindenburg Line had been rent asunder, and the division consolidated on the Green Line, indicated here, as the 32nd Division started to move forward to continue the attack. On their right, the 1st Division also began to move east. The line these two divisions reached late on the 29th is shown here. Extraordinary, as it seems. The Germans were left with no alternative but to try to tighten their defence on their final reserve line, the Beauvoir-Fonsomme line. And I could go on. I'll just mention that there remains some very heavy fighting ahead. The 46th Division eventually back in the lead, suffering heavy losses, more than on the 29th of September, including 2 COs killed, when it tore into the German defences on the 3rd and 4th of October at Ramicourt, Montbretagne, and on Doon Hill and Mannequin Hill. Perhaps the crowning glory for the division was the 2 VCs won on the 3rd. One was by Sergeant William Johnson of the 1st 5th Sherwood Foresters for dealing with German machine gun nests to the rear of the support line. The other was by Lance Corporal Bill Coltman from Burton-on-Trent, a stretcher bearer in the 1st 6th North Staffords. With an MID, a military medal and bar, and a DCM to his name, he'd won a bar to his DCM at Riqueval Bridge and the VC on Mannequin Hill 4 days later to be the most highly decorated British soldier of the war. On the 29th of September 1918, the 46th North Midland Division, and especially 137 Staffordshire Brigade, had inserted the tactical key that unlocked the door for our entry into the main Hindenburg system in its most formidable part, and the British Army was now almost into the green fields beyond. Well, just a short postscript before I end. This isn't a heavily visited part of the Western Front. The St. Quentin Canal remains in working order. There's a lovely view from the Riqueval Bridge, very much recognisable as that battered structure of 1918. The landscape is perhaps less recognisable, the natural growth having long covered the devastated scene in the war. Unsurprisingly, the 46th Division placed a memorial to its achievements close to the canal and near to La Barraque Cemetery. The cross placed there soon after these events was eventually replaced by a stone obelisk, and it's easily missed just off the main St. Quentin Cambrai Road. On the 29th September 2018, 100 years to the day, following a tour of that momentous battlefield, a small ceremony took place at the WFA Memorial by the Riqueval Bridge. The memorial, having been renovated, was rededicated with Gary Sheffield and Colin Wagstaff present, and alongside descendants of some of the 1st 6th North Staffords who'd taken part. The grandchildren and one great-grandson of Humphrey Charlton had come over from Canada with his DSO. Brothers Rod and Steve Barron, whose grandfather, Lieutenant Roderick Barron, was the battalion intelligence officer, travelled from Scotland. Barron had come from the 1st 5th North and was awarded an MC at the war's end, and he's circled here in this unbeatable photograph. Humphrey Charlton is actually standing on the bridge right next to General Campbell, who's the nearest to the camera. I like to think too that perhaps Bill Coltman is right at the top there, holding up a stretcher. And that day, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Bailey, RAMC, represented his great uncle, Lance Corporal Ernest Tyrer, MM and Bar. And I was brought down to earth at the end of it all when I was approached by an old gentleman with a broad Stoke accent who declared that Private Frank Leadbeater, I said Leadbetter, the response to which was Leadbeater, can't you read, was his father. Frank Leadbeater was Humphrey Charlton's Batman, and in the fog on the bridge was ordered to guard it with rifle and bayonet and his life if needs be, and gained the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Well, I think fitting tribute to what that 4th Leicester, Captain John Milne, wrote the Staffordshire Terrier a fine fighting breed. Thank you, everybody.
That was absolutely superb, Jim. Thoroughly enjoyed that. That was a masterclass. Ladies and gentlemen, if we'd like to raise our hands in the usual manner on Zoom, using the software below as a virtual round of applause, Jim, I can confirm that you've got a deafening round of applause for that. That was an absolute tour de force. Thanks ever so much. It's question and answer time now, ladies and gentlemen. So let's grab Ian Wallace first of all. Hello, Ian.
Hello. Absolutely stunning. Thoroughly enjoyed that, as did my wife. And the key question that I have is, given the amount of artillery that was expended and their importance, did the two bridges survive because of orders, or despite orders?
What a good question. The answer to which I do not know. I can only assume that the intelligent application of the artillery for this battle would assiduously have avoided hitting the bridges. You'll have seen that Bel-Inglis Bridge had been destroyed. I don't know when it was destroyed, sometime in 1917. I think the Germans had rebuilt it. It was that wooden structure that the 6th South Staffords belonged to. And the whole place had been knocked apart. And certainly the bridge, and there's damage to the bridge that you can still see today. And the contemporary photographs show it as being fairly knocked about, quite a difficult target. But if they'd intended to knock it down, I would have thought the British artillery would have had no trouble in knocking it down. So my assumption, Ian, is that in the orders, it was to avoid hitting that bridge.
Thank you very much, Brigadier.
Thanks very much. Peter Newnham.
Thanks for that, Jim. It's brilliant. One of the things that really struck me from those excellent maps of yours was that as the Midlanders advanced across the canal, and the 1st Division, initially at least, wasn't there a danger of significant flanking fire from south of the canal? And if so, was there any plans to
I think,
okay. Peter, I think we've got your question there. We've got some really bad buffering though. Yeah. So I think you've got the gist of the question there.
I think so. And the danger, the ever-present danger of there being fire from your own side. I hadn't looked at the 1st Division in detail, but the orders make it clear, as with 46th Division, there were great constraints laid down on the supporting artillery and machine gun barrages, and the same for the 1st Division. And it's interesting to see what the 1st Division achieved, because their one job was to fix the Germans there in place. Indeed, I was looking also at Debney's 1st French Army to the right of 1st Division and their effect on the battle. And the French had quite a difficult day. They couldn't achieve their objectives that day. The 1st French Army was not a priority for the French attacks that were going on. But 1st Division had limited objectives, actually achieved all their objectives for that day and were ready to cross the canal on the 2nd day. But there's no evidence of any blue on blue, any fratricide caused by 1st Division's limited attack.
Peter, is that okay? Have we answered your question there?
Well, it answered a question. It wasn't my question. I was more concerned about the German positions south of the canal that hadn't initially been attacked by 1st Division, and their ability to flank.
I hadn't heard that. I hadn't heard the German part. No, they were held in place. The 1st Division achieved its objectives, and they held the Germans in place south of Bel-Inglis.
Thanks, Peter. Ted.
Thanks, Thanks, Jim. I thought I knew about this battle, but you've just enlightened me. I have to admit, I was a Stafford too, and Jim and I are old friends, but I'm coming at this with that view, having been an officer in the Staffords. And Jim, and you well know that Midlands men are pretty phlegmatic, and that may have been how they withstood the reverses of 15, 16 and 17. What I'm wondering is, with Brigadier John Campbell winning his VC, with rallying his troops with a hunting horn, certainly eccentric, possibly mad, and Jerry Boyd, one of the stars of the First World War as divisional commander, if only for a month. Do you think that the sort of extra flair that they brought was a factor in the success of this operation?
It must have been. A lot of people who listen will be familiar with a pretty sorry tale of the division for much of the war. And and I'd recommend, if you want to get into the detail of this and the ups and downs of the division, Simon People's book, Mud, Blood and Determination, gets into a lot of detail. He talks about the learning curve and touches on the matter of command. And I was looking at it again, especially in relation to John Campbell. Campbell had won his VC on the Somme. He was a guardsman, and while his style of leadership clearly didn't lead to much later in the war and after the war, it just felt to me, Ted, that it was exactly what was required at the time. And that made me look at Gerald Boyd some more. And they were frontline generals. What the soldiers needed was someone in command, a leader who would come and see them and share their travails, which Montague Stuart Wortley famously had not done. And there were all sorts of things about him, and he clearly did not get on with his corps commander or his army commander, which will account for at least part in his sacking. But Campbell and Boyd demonstrated leadership in the field, and that would have improved the morale of those soldiers no end. I thought the most telling thing was Gerald Boyd talking about when he wrote down his thoughts about it, about this was another sacrificial stunt, but in no way did he hand that thought on to his soldiers. He said, we are honored to have this position and we're going to do it to the best of our ability. So yeah, it was Ted, you know me, leadership is everything as far as I'm concerned, whether it's in Tesco's or on the battlefield. And there it worked for the soldiers of that division. And you're right, they can be an obdurate lot.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for your question there, Ted. Thanks very much. Got a few questions all on the same theme, Jim. I mean, we've got one from Andrew Vollans. What was it that made the attack work so well, intermingled with others asking about why was the division chosen after it had such a bad reputation, or mixed reputation, shall we say, hitherto? Clearly not an elite force, but still it was chosen for this fundamentally ever so important attack. Any explanation why that division was chosen for that and what went so well on the day?
It's difficult, isn't it? It's the remember that I think we must remember that this was not the main effort. This was not the army main effort. That was with the Australians and the Americans. Rawlinson had needed another division, Why he selected 46th North Midland Division, I do not know, because I think what the questioners are saying is, right, this is not a guarantee of success, is it? This is two big attacks that they've done in this war so far, and neither worked out well for the division at all. And what Simon People says about them being in the about this thing, people I think make a bit too much of this learning curve thing. Learning curve happens in every war. The British Army does tend to stumble around a bit to start with, and then learns through experience and through the replacement of unsuccessful leaders with more successful men. But and Simon Peoples talks about them being in the slow lane. These were in the various tracks of the motorway. These fellows had been in the slow lane, not as you said, David, not an elite division, not an attack division, a trench holding division.
Yeah.
So why entrust this with them? Maybe Gerald Boyd had it right. We're in for another bloody sacrificial stunt here. And we're just going to be sold down the river or down the canal, while the Australians and the Americans get on with it on the left. But these were not. Rawlinson was a fairly stiff gentleman, but not without feeling, and he wouldn't be throwing away their lives. And they were given every possible means to guarantee success. And even if they'd only broken across the canal and into the first part of the main position, it would have been quite an achievement. It would have had the Germans reeling, and throwing in reserves into that area where perhaps then the attacks on the Canal du Nord to the north would have benefited even further. And as it turned out, and we don't know why the 46th was chosen. Well, I don't know, perhaps somebody does. And what a success it turned out to be.
Sure. Thanks for that. You touched there on a couple of points, which I'll bring Robert Eilert in on right now. Robert's got a question, so if you unmute yourself, and there's similar questions as well to Robert's from elsewhere. So Robert, just fire away with your question, and I'll come in with a supplementary from David Muir, who's asked a similar question.
Yes, thank you, David. Many years ago, when I first started studying these things, it was received wisdom that it was the Australians who broken the Hindenburg line. And as you study it, you realise that that was not the case. And my question was, having the Australians and, as you point out, the Americans to the north, was this more a help, a hindrance than a help? But can I ask a supplemental one as well? You kindly mentioned Bill Johnson, and I wrote a short booklet about Bill for my local council when we dedicated the government-provided plaque. And why, when the artillery bombardment on the 28th of September was so colossal, when it came to the attack on Ramacore, Bill won his VC, why was it so relatively light?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you say the losses on that attack were greater than on the canal itself. And I think the lack of the artillery support must be one answer to that. Yeah. Sorry to go on so long. You are very patient, David, in allowing me to do so.
Thanks, Robert, for that. Whilst you're just pondering on Robert's twin track approach there, there's a third track as well, just to bring in, which is David Muir's question, which touches on Robert's first point, which David says, you mentioned the problems with the Australian-American forces on the left flank of the 46th Division. John Terrain suggests that Monash's planning for this part of the overall operation was less thorough than for earlier operations, and the Australians were almost worn out. Could you comment on this? So there's a mass of questions there, Jim, if you can try and untangle that.
Let me deal with the Australians and Americans first. You're right. The Australians have been used. I've taken tours of Australians on the Western Front, and the first day or so is a certain amount of education is required. I'm not saying that by being cynical, but just to persuade them that there were other soldiers fighting on the Western Front at the same time. And I have had a bit of that. And the Australian Corps, we all know how magnificent the soldiers were so much of the time, and under Monash and his subordinates particularly well led. But it was, I suspect, exhausted. It was extremely good at its job, but it was exhausted. The Americans were very fresh, but very, very green. And they were learning. I haven't studied the Americans in much detail at all, but they were learning what the British and the French armies had been learning for some years. And their attack, they were let down on the 29th of September. The whole corps was let down by the American failures. And the American failures, they had everything for them. They had the artillery, just the same as 46th Division. They had a lack of leadership, especially at the junior level. Pershing had pulled away half of the officers for training. So they were lacking junior officers, they were lacking experienced NCOs, and they ground to a halt. And so the Australians had to pick up that fight at the end of the day on the 29th of September, and did get through, but the line had been broken by the North Midlanders. So the Germans were on the back foot. And it is slightly galling when you hear the tales. When we were there in September 2018, there was an American group, and you see the memorial to the north of Bellinglees, a magnificent American memorial. And the 46th North Midland Division Memorial seems a bit pathetic by comparison. And I knew some of the Americans by chance. One of them I'd worked with, who'd been in the US Army. And he told the story of great American success on the 29th of September. It was a little bewildering. Robert's absolutely right about the fighting on the 3rd and the 4th of October. Like other attempts at breakthrough during the war, it so depended on the artillery getting up and being in range, and there was insufficient artillery. The attack on the 29th of September had not been long in the planning, but it had been long enough. But the fighting on the 3rd and the 4th of October, there was a short term for the planning, and the German counterattacks were ferocious. And a lot of their artillery was still intact, having been pulled back. And that accounts for some pretty severe casualties over those 2 days on those bare-arsed hilltops. If you've ever been there, it's pretty bleak up there beyond the canal. So yeah, I completely agree with you, Robert. Insufficient artillery in support, but the men held their ground as much as they could, and as the Germans were falling back everywhere else, and the French, indeed, by then the French First Army had got around St. Quentin and was on the move to the south and southeast of Fourth Army, and so the Germans were going back. So their success was temporary.
Thanks for that. David King, you've been waiting patiently there. You've got a couple of questions. I think one we've broadly touched on with the previous answers, but if you want to fire in possibly your first question there to Jim.
Yes, thank you. Jim, thank you very much. I did a battlefield tour, a Second World War battlefield tour, which was led by General Sir John Mogg and he talked about being suddenly put in command of a battalion, and he didn't even know who the company commanders were. There he was giving orders to complete strangers. And I noticed in your talk, most of the COs were from other battalions. How did that work?
Many of them have been there for a while. They'd come in as perfectly normal, as you will know, for officers to move around like that. Less so much for the soldiers. When I was saying about the on one day, I'll find the time to work this out, is that the number of men, let's just take 137 Brigade, the number of men from Staffordshire in the brigade were certainly a lot less than there had been in 1914. But then I looked at the awards, and so many of those men were Staffordshire men, from privates to officers. So there was still a good smattering, but also, I think it's illuminating to see that one of the officers had been a corporal in the East Yorkshires, an officer had been a chap in the veterinary corps, and they all came in, but it doesn't take that long, and it's surprising how, being on operations, you very quickly get to know the soldiers in your command, possibly not all by name. But David, a lot of those officers, and again, without having studied it in that fine detail, a lot of those officers would have been there for some time, and would have got to know their men.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Thanks for your question there, David. Mark Bailey, do you want just to start your video and unmute yourself there?
Brigadier Jim, good evening. Thank you for an excellent and very wide-ranging talk. I think my question's probably been answered, actually, which was, again, why was it so difficult to take the Rickerval line in comparison to the successes in the preceding few days? And I think you've probably answered that, unless you want to add a bit more.
I'm just trying to think if I can add to it a bit more. Mark Bailey was with us in 2018, and it was his great uncle who got an MM and bar later in the war, and has discovered that another great uncle was a first Sixth North Stafford. Another great uncle was a first Fifth North Stafford as well, and it is. The division was running out of steam, that's without a doubt. And beyond the 4th of October, its fighting power was certainly greatly diminished through exhaustion as much as physical casualties. But it was what I was saying to Robert earlier. It was the inability to get all of the artillery up, especially in that huge concentration that there had been up until the 29th of September, that was quite telling. And the Germans were not done yet. That whole idea of the all being let down, the Germans were exhausted, even more so, but they weren't done yet, as you can see if you go to those hilltops on the 3rd and 4th of October of that year. But the German, when I was reading a bit more about this, and I would dearly love to get into some more of the German detail, the German reserves were spent. That was their problem. They knew that having lost that reserve line, the Beauvoir-Fonsomme line, they had nothing else to put in, and they could no longer do that thing that they'd done for the whole of the war, was reinforce failure faster than the British Army could reinforce success.
Super. Thanks for that. Thanks for your question, Mark. Just one final question, because we're now actually on the 9:30 cutting off time, which like to not go too far beyond 9:30 on these. Jim, how would you describe? Would you describe this as Braithwaite's plan in any respect? Obviously, he'd been a successful divisional commander in charge of the war-winning, if I can say, 62nd West Riding Division, and became corps commander. So would you consider Braithwaite as almost the man who won the war here, or is that over-egging it?
No, I think I don't think so. I can say that to a Yorkshireman. Certainly. I noticed actually that Boyd was a Yorkshireman. He was he'd been commissioned in the East Yorkshires in the Boer War, with whom he won his DSO and was colonel of their regiment until he died very young at the age of 52 when he was military secretary. But just to go back to your point, David, yes, the planning staffs, the general officers, including Braithwaite and their staffs, knew exactly what they were doing. Some of them still appear, don't they? You look at the photographs of them in 1918, and they still appear a little like the faces of the incompetent swine, as they might have been written off as. But they weren't. And from Haig down, well, I salute them. I think they had such a stupendous army by then.
Absolutely. Jim, it's now after 9:30, so I think what we're going to do, even though with apologies to everybody whose questions we haven't answered, we'll call that a day at this point. So if you care to raise your hand again as a virtual round of applause, we will I can confirm that there's absolutely stacks of hands going up.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
As a round of applause. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've thoroughly enjoyed that. I know everybody else has. If you have enjoyed the talk, please do join us for our later ones later in the month. And it just leaves me to say once again a sincere thanks for Jim for a superb presentation, which has been thoroughly enjoyable by everybody. And I wish everybody a good night.
Thank you, David. Good night, everyone.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières.